Hello and welcome to the Grant Street Experience. I'm your host, Grant Ervin. Rebecca's on vacation this week, so she's getting rested up for our next episode. But I had a chance to bring in a guest this week, and we have Michele Abbott with us. Michele, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's exciting. Rebecca sends her regrets. She was excited to talk with you, but I was like, hey, we got to get this one in while Michele is available. So we're excited to talk with you and learn about the work that you're doing for on behalf of the great city of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Maybe to get the conversation started, tell us a little bit about Michele Abbott and kind of your background and what brought you to the work that we're going to talk about today, specifically the ACEPGH program.
Sure. So I started my career at Abt Associates doing USAID work in global health system strengthening, and saw in a lot of these health programs that the things that were really impacting health outcomes at a country level were really not related to health, and were in fact food security and poverty and access to jobs and how the country was doing as a whole. So I got interested in unconditional cash transfers, which started in the development world, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and has slowly gained traction. So I pivoted from health and applied to the party-ran graduate school to get a doctorate in public policy, to try and focus on some of those other factors that impact long-term health outcomes. So I wrote my research statement interested in cash transfers, but unfortunately was unable to pursue that line of research while I was there. I was at RAND for about 7 years, doing a lot of mental health and cross-sector intervention, program analysis, and research. Got a lot of great experience, worked with a lot of great colleagues. And then I, during the pandemic, was just writing my dissertation and kind of isolated and interested in the next phase of life, and saw this job opportunity come up to run a guaranteed income pilot in Pittsburgh. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm here for. So I applied and I got the job, and I'm really excited to be here. This is something that I've been interested in for a decade, and I think that a lot of my experience has led me right up to this point.
That's awesome. That is an amazing trajectory, and we're so fortunate to have found you. Maybe for listeners and for myself a little bit, I remember reading about some of the stuff around unconditional cash transfers, and that goes back to like the Grameen Bank days. Is that right?
Yeah.
Can you you're like, wow, he knew that. That's crazy. Talk a little bit about what is an unconditional cash transfer and how it's played a major role in the developing world in terms of alleviating poverty and encouraging entrepreneurship and the like.
Sure. Let me see. I don't even know if I know who first started it, but microfinancing really became popular 15 or 20 years ago. And it was like micro lending for people who are unbanked or in the informal sector. How do you get them access to assets where they can grow their businesses? So micro lending groups became really popular, where people would pool funding. Someone would get it for a specific period of time, either like a month or a year or whatever the program was, and then they would pay back into it and kind of circulate cash that way. Then different organizations started providing conditional cash transfers. So if you give money to a low income or rural household and stipulate that the kids must complete school instead of working to support that household, does it improve outcomes? And they found yes. Overall, it was increasing the amount of time kids spent in school and graduation rates. But then someone was like, well, what if we just give unconditional cash transfers? Do we see the same outcomes, or do we lose them? And I think overall, the synthesis is that in general, unconditional cash transfers do just as well, if not better, than conditional cash transfers. So, people are using this money to meet their basic needs. I think at this point in time, education is highly valued of everyone across the world. And so if you have the opportunity to send your kids to school, you're doing it. If you have the opportunity to put more and better food on your table, you're doing it. Keeping, shelter over your heads and those of your loved ones and extended family. So that, has taken off in the past decade or so, but we have, it's more recent that we've started to see guaranteed income or cash transfers happen in a developed world context, in Western Europe and North America. So there was a guaranteed income pilot in Canada in like the 70s, I think. I'm forgetting the name.
Was that the Manitoba experiment? Yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of fell apart for administrative reasons. And so people have unburied that data that was collected on paper records from the 70s and kind of re-evaluated or reanalyzed it to see what it found. And there's also positive income. So in terms of healthcare and utilization of money for basic needs and even work outcomes. So that was kind of the impetus to advocate for guaranteed income programs in the U.S.
Going back to kind of your research a little bit, like what drove you to that topic? So coming from like a health perspective, what drove you to want to dive deeper in terms of that research?
So I'm really interested in the social determinants of health. So how the environment that you work and live in impacts long-term health outcomes. And somebody said this is not my coined phrase, but the opposite of health is not sickness, but it's poverty. And so they really go hand in hand. You see poor health outcomes at every level, at the individual level, at the household level, community and country level, where there's more income inequality and poverty. So I started in health, but I was really interested in what is actually influencing these health outcomes in terms of the lives that people live and the way that we experience the world. So got more interested in poverty work, and cash transfers and guaranteed income in general to me is really interesting because it really supports autonomy of individuals and households and financial freedom to create the life you want to create. So it's really the least paternalistic option that I've seen in terms of supporting individuals and households to improve their lives.
Interesting. And tell me about your experience at RAND. So RAND is obviously a nationally, internationally kind of recognized research institute that has a strong presence, and I've heard oftentimes the best office in the RAND network here in Pittsburgh. Oftentimes ranked as one of the best places to work in Pittsburgh too. So maybe tell us a little bit about your experience there and the team at RAND in terms of how they're integrating with the community and kind of asking some of these tough questions and looking at the data that is underneath of them.
Sure. So I entered RAND through the graduate school. So I was in Santa Monica, which is the headquarters and the home of the graduate school, for 3 years, taking coursework. But the interesting thing about the PhD program is that you work on RAND projects while you're completing coursework and qualifying exams and running your dissertation. So it's called on-the-job training. So you get a really great experience working on research projects, writing proposals, etc. I transferred to the Pittsburgh office for personal reasons for a boy, and have really enjoyed my time here. Fell in love with Pittsburgh, but RAND is really good at working across sectors, across industries, and also across offices. So it didn't really impact my work that I was doing, switching offices. So that's been great. And RAND has a lot. I mean, I've worked on many projects that are really community focused, community participatory research. How do you bring people into designing the research questions and making sure the data collection tools are not too invasive or overwhelming, through to how do we how do we interpret these findings and how do we make them relevant to practitioners and community members to what they're learning? So I worked on many mental health program evaluations, actually. So one of the biggest ones was in New York City, Connections to Care, which is actually part of the Thrive Initiative and the Mayor's Fund in New York City. So that was fairly high profile. And it was a impact evaluation, implementation, and cost. So a three-pronged evaluation. And the impact was mixed or null. So we didn't see huge improvements in client level health outcomes, but we did see, they were moving in the right direction. They just weren't significant. But on the implementation side, it was really interesting. We heard a lot of great positive feedback from staff members on how a lot of these mental health trainings and support that they were receiving were improving their lives and their ability to provide resources to the community. And then we also saw some cost savings. It changed depending on which costs we included, but one of the biggest costs to the city is incarceration. And so if you can reduce incarceration, you really save so much money because it's so expensive to have people in jail.
Because they were seeing the investment happen on the front end, which alleviated the cost on the back end?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Who ran, just curious, I've heard of the Thrive NYC program that operated through the Mayor's Fund of New York City. Who was the ultimate kind of implementer, operator of the project?
So there's pushback in politics around Thrive that I'm not fully aware of, but the Thrive Initiative was through the Mayor's Fund, and it was the First Lady's thought child. She created it, and so there was, I think, some pushback that there wasn't rigorous evaluation of many of the different programs under that initiative. But the Connections to Care one is one that did have very rigorous analysis through RAND and partners at NYU as well. So that program was working with a bunch of community-based organizations to increase mental health awareness and skills. So those organizations were very small, very well embedded in the community, and focus on different target populations, whether it was youth, job training, parents and children.
Interesting. Maybe let's pivot a little bit towards some of your current work. So for me, just a quick little backdrop, we first started to be introduced to the concept of universal basic income through our engagement with an organization called the Royal Society for Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce as part of our Pittsburgh, Glasgow Sister Cities arrangement, and working with the Royal Society for Arts, or RSA Scotland, actually. And so they had a series of expertise in basic income, and we're doing a lot of work. In fact, they oftentimes cite the program that you mentioned up in Canada, as well as pilots that were occurring in Finland and in Scotland, and so there's a growing momentum about the concept of basic income or guaranteed income. And so it's been fascinating to see that really start to take shape. Fast forward to today, and we've had this opportunity now through some of the work of our colleagues Oliver Beasley and Majestic Lane and Lindsay Powell and others in the mayor's office to really start to spearhead this because of a lot of the data that we're seeing with the challenges with a number of populations, particularly African American women, as being a way to provide kind of that pathway to healthier opportunities. Maybe could you start a little bit and talk about the difference? There's a lot of terminology here. Talk about the difference between universal basic income versus guaranteed income, and then maybe a little bit of history too would be helpful, I think.
Sure. So basic income is just a base level of money given monthly, no strings attached. And it's called basic because it's not intended to to take the place of work income. It's just enough to give you a floor upon which you can stand up and live your life. So universal basic income is, was made, I think, popular in common society through Andrew Yang's presidential campaign. And universal basic income is that everyone in the country would just get X amount of money monthly ad infinitum. And so guaranteed income is the same idea, but usually targeted to different populations, whether that's, if there's an income threshold, so it's just low income folks, if it's homeless or housing insecure folks, if it's transition age youth. So you're really targeting a finite amount of money to specific populations that are the most vulnerable. So what we're doing in Pittsburgh is a guaranteed income because we have a finite amount of money and are making our investment targeted towards those who need it the most. So you mentioned the Office of Equity in the mayor's office, and I would mention that the idea or the impetus for this guaranteed income pilot in Pittsburgh was a direct response to the Gender Equity Commission report that University of Pittsburgh did with some others and came out in 2019. And it found, compared to 100 similar cities, Pittsburgh is the worst for Black women on a number of different metrics, including income, economics, and health outcomes. So the idea of this guaranteed income pilot is that half of the participants would be targeted to be Black women whose household income is less than 50% of the area median income. And then the other half will be randomly selected from 5 different zip codes in the city. So getting a little bit into the details, but it's really a couple of years ago in 2019, actually, prior to the pandemic, I went to the Greater Pittsburgh Nonprofit Summit, which was a super interesting experience for me. But, the Gender Equity Commission report had just come out and people were not surprised. This is a problem that everyone who has paid attention is aware of exists in Pittsburgh. And people were frustrated because every 5-10 years, we have another report that comes out that shows we have all these inequities and all these disparities and nothing ever changes. So what is happening? So this is one pathway by which the mayor's office decided they're going to try and see if they can make change happen.
That's awesome. And so we're not alone, though. That's the other thing that I think is really interesting about this. So there's a group, maybe you could talk about Mayors for Guaranteed Income, is that right? And tell me about that network and who's a part of it and what's that all about?
Sure. So Mayor Michael Tubbs, who is the mayor of Stockton, California, started one of the first guaranteed income pilots in the country. I should also mention that Magnolia Mothers Fund in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, was, I think, probably the real first, and they've been instrumental in the network and the community and really leading the charge. But Mayor Michael Tubbs started the Stockton demonstration project called SEED, and that went for 2 years. And as part of that program, he started Mayors for Guaranteed Income, which is a national coalition of mayors focused on advocacy and evidence building around a guaranteed income at a state or federal level. So SEED, the pilot demonstration in California, has finished up, and earlier this year in March, they released their first year results, and they were incredibly positive. They saw financial stability increase, they saw unemployment decrease, full-time employment increase, and mental health outcomes got a lot better in terms of depression, anxiety, and stress. So that's just preliminary results. They have a whole nother year of data to crunch, but that really has led the way to bringing other mayors on board. And Mayor Peduto was also one of not the first cohort, but shortly thereafter joined the charge and spearheaded this pilot that's happening in Pittsburgh. So Mayors for Guaranteed Income is one of our partners. They're providing lessons learned and cross-fertilization of data and connections across a bunch of different cities who are also running pilots this year.
And we should also, I want to unpack that a little bit. But first, maybe the name of the project you're leading is ACEPGH, right? And so why ACE and what does that stand for?
So ACEPGH is an acronym, and it stands for Assured Cash Experiment of Pittsburgh.
And so that title is kind of important, right? And so why is that assured cash in those examples you've talked about from Stockton? I don't want to assume that it's obvious, but like, why have those outcomes ultimately improved in places that have led these pilots? Like, what is the cash being used for, and how is that, basically creating these more positive outcomes or positive trajectories?
Yeah. So in SEED, for example, they targeted Stockton residents who lived in census tracts where the area median income was fairly low. So these are being targeted to lower income households or households living in lower income areas, communities. So a lot of the money has been spent on basic needs, and Stockton's pilot has an online dashboard that shows you how all of the money was spent. And so 40% of that money was spent on food, for example, really combating food insecurity, which is a huge indicator for long-term health outcomes and also mental health outcomes. Then that was followed by like retail, utilities, and transportation and auto care were the main categories. So the idea of guaranteed income with no strings attached, it does allow you to respond to your basic needs, but it also allows the flexibility for those needs that you have to change month on month or year on year. So you may be worried about putting food on the table this month, but after you have a couple of months of cushion under you, maybe it's, my car broke down and suddenly I'm able to get it fixed instead of scrambling to figure out public transportation and carpooling for my children and all this stuff. So it's really giving you the freedom to respond weekly or monthly to what your needs are, with the understanding that life is diverse and it's crazy and there's a lot of variation, and it's a little silly to think that policymakers know exactly all of the difficulties that households and individuals face on a regular basis. So,
one of the things that makes me think about like why we raise this issue through, if I go way back for myself, and Rebecca would do this if she was here probably, but like when we think about the work that we did with our OnePGH initiative and really starting to bring resilience into the conversation around city government, was just exactly that on a policy level, having the ability to have agility to respond to whatever crisis we may need. And so in many regards, this isn't a question, but it's a statement, I guess, is that like, this is really providing that at the individual level, right? The ability for an individual or a household to have capacity or the freedom or the peace of mind and the agility to respond to whatever life's crises bring. So you're building personal resilience, right?
Yeah, 100%.
It's really amazing. I mean, have you in Stockton, and then I want to kind of get into like the rollout here of ACEPGH, but in Stockton, have they started to collect some of the individual stories and kind of the narrative, like people's individual lived experience with the program?
Yeah, they have. And so as the Magnolia Mothers Fun, they partnered with a local magazine to publish some of these stories. So a big push for the Mayors for Guaranteed Income pilot groups has been on storytelling and narrative change. So, a lot of our country's welfare programs have been really entrenched with these myths of poverty that have persisted for decades. And I'm switching from a researcher perspective to a practitioner and understanding that even though the data supports a lot of these interventions and pilots that we're seeing, it's not really going to create change until you can change the cultural understanding of what's happening. And a lot of that is going to be based on individual stories. So I was just actually reading up on some of them. So there was this one woman, Tia, who was a single mom with 2 kids and had a job prior to this, but received her monthly stipend, and was really talking about how, first of all, it's really decreased her stress. So she hasn't been so stressed out when her car breaks down, for example. She can take it straight to the auto repair shop rather than waiting for the next paycheck to come through. She was able to move from a cramped apartment to a house. So her kids have more room to spread out, and that's been great for them. And then she was talking, one of the biggest arguments against, one of the most common, I guess I should say, arguments against guaranteed income is that people are not going to work if you give them money. And we just haven't seen that play out in the data, but it's also important to see what it looks like in an individual life. So she was saying, there's no way I'm going to stop working because more income is always better than less. So this just adds to my well-being and my ability to respond to my kids' needs. But what it has been able to do is when her youngest daughter is sick, instead of like scrambling to try and find someone to care for her kid, she can just take a day off work and not worry about meeting bills or putting food on the table. So it, in a world where a lot of the jobs that we have don't come with sick pay, it gives people the flexibility to respond to either their own health issues or the health issues of their kids. But she also was able to take a vacation. So for the first time in 20 years, she took a road trip to visit her father, who her kids had never met before.
Wow.
So, you could say that was decreasing the amount she worked, but, is that really decreasing workload, or is that just giving you the freedom to live life the way so many other Americans already get to live?
That's really amazing. We've recently seen in the news and experienced personally, like the child tax credit benefit that the Biden administration has approved and is now kind of hitting the streets over the last few months. What's the conversation in the guaranteed or basic income circles been with that program? And it's a real live living example, I'm going to assume, of what a basic income can do for a family. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
No, the child tax credit is super exciting. And I know that there's been so much coverage right now about whether it will be expanded or not. And everyone who's interested in guaranteed income is full force supporting the expansion of the child tax credits. We only have preliminary evidence right now. It started in July, so it's only been out for a few months, but the preliminary evidence we do have is incredible. People are spending it again on basic needs, food, shelter, clothing. They're also using it to pay down debt or to add to emergency savings, and they're using it to save for children's college funds. And so that's, the areas where most of the money has been going. And then AEI just released a report on their survey and found that it was like 85% or something it hasn't changed their work output. 5% of the people increased their workload, and then 5% of people decreased their workload. So they've also found that it hasn't had any impact on employment outcomes. And I do think it's also important to mention that it's okay if people work less or stop working. We're in a pandemic, and the education system has been stop and go for so long as counties and states respond to the pandemic's fluctuations over time. And so I think a lot of the decrease in employment is due to just switching that labor from formal workforce to informal childcare and elder care. That's another crisis our country's facing. So
which is work. Let's also be clear, that's work
exactly.
too.
So we talk about employment outcomes, but we're really just talking about like paid formal labor, not work in general. People like to work. It gives people meaning, and they will work. You're always going to have like one or a handful of people who don't, but most people who have households with other individuals and children and older folks, they're working for the same outcome.
It's really interesting because we've had, I mentioned the Royal Society for Arts and Manufacturers and Commerce that helped introduce this concept. And what's fascinating too in hearing you say that is there's a whole parallel and really probably intersected conversation that we've had with the RSA about the future of work, right? And so we've started to experience that obviously in real time through the pandemic. And instead of here being in the studio, you're in a virtual experience here with me right now. That 18 months, 24 months ago, that this conversation wouldn't be possible, right? In the way that we're having it. And so finding ways to adapt to that, go up and down the economic spectrum. What's What's your sense, I guess, and you mentioned like Andrew Yang and kind of his campaign, but like what's your sense, given the changes that we've seen from the pandemic, how a program like guaranteed income or basic income can help address some of those challenges that go along with the quote unquote future of work?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have the exact answer, but it certainly gives individuals flexibility if, they're working in the gig economy, or working multiple part-time jobs, so you don't get benefits. It gives you the flexibility to take time off work, again, to respond to healthcare needs or additional training and education, or applying to a new job that's more secure. When you think about it at like a national level, a lot of these guaranteed income pilots that are happening at the city level are really interested in proving that it works and that it's useful and it improves outcomes. And also, how do we do this? Like, what are the logistical implementations that, how do we actually run a program like this? But in terms of financial sustainability, I think it really needs to happen on a federal level, if not federal and state level. California is a good example. Stockton started the push, and then now LA City is rolling out a huge pilot, I think this week, and a bunch of other cities in California are as well. But also the state, there's a state level guaranteed income pilot now, and it's focusing on kids who are transitioning out of foster care and expectant mothers. So that has, there's more funding available at the higher level you go. And so I think in terms of financial sustainability, that's the way it needs to happen. People have really strong opinions on targeted groups for guaranteed income, only people who are low income versus universal basic income, which would cut down on administrative burden. I don't know how strong my opinions are on that. I think there's pros and cons to each, and mostly I just want anything to happen. So that's why I'm so excited about the child tax credit and really hope that it gets expanded.
That's awesome. So ACEPGH is one of the first projects that is powered by the OnePGH Fund, which is basically been created to help initiate public sector innovation here in Pittsburgh. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the next steps for ACEPGH, and as you start to, you're in kind of a planning phase right now, but getting soon ready and able to kind of kickstart stuff and put it into gear. What are some of your next steps for ACEPGH that you can share with listeners?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of media coverage. A couple of weeks ago, the mayor requested ARPA funding, American Rescue Plan Act funding, from City Council, and so that went through City Council approval process and got approval to use some of that funding to run this pilot. So we're still waiting for the contracts and requirements related to that to go through. So in the interim, until the funds are available and transferred, we're really working on putting together all of the pieces in place so we can hit the ground running as soon as the work comes through. One of our main partners is the Pittsburgh's Financial Empowerment Center, which is a public-private partnership between the city and neighborhood allies. And so they provide free one-on-one financial counseling to anyone in the city who needs it. So they'll be helping us with onboarding and participant enrollment and benefits counseling. So maybe take a step back. I mentioned earlier, but the structure of ACEPGH is that we'll have 200 participants providing $500 a month for 24 months. And then half of those participants will be pre-existing FEC clients who are Black women whose household income is less than 50% area median income. And the other half will be randomly selected from 5 different zip codes in the city. Those zip codes are more economically disadvantaged. And so we'll be working with the FEC to develop the client list for the first half of the target group, and then working with community organizations to get the word out to do recruitment for the other half. So that recruitment for the second half will be mail based. So we'll be mailing out recruitment letters to households that fall within those 5 zip codes. And really interested in opening as many communication channels as possible. One of the lessons learned from Stockton was that people didn't believe that these letters they were getting in the mail were real. They thought they were a hoax, which, you know, whenever you hear someone wants to give you money for free, no strings attached, you're like, that can't be true.
Right.
But no, so just making as many connections as possible with people working in the community and trying to get the word out. So we haven't started recruitment yet. We're waiting for funding to transfer, but once we start recruitment, there will be a huge communications and media push to get everything, get the word out.
Awesome. That's exciting. So just up against time here, and so I need to pivot to the last section that we always have here with some of our guests, which is what are you reading, listening, or watching? So we're always interested to see kind of what's on your bedstand, your coffee table, or your television, or in your earbuds that is kind of piquing your interest these days.
So I just finished this book, but I loved it and I've told everyone about it. It's a book about mushrooms, about fungi. It's called.
I really wish Rebecca was here right now, but that's a whole aside. Go ahead.
It's called Entangled Life by, I think, Martin Sheldrake is his name, which is also an awesome name, but he's like a biologist, mycologist / poet. So he just like loves mushrooms and has researched them, but also is just a great writer and, you know, completely enamored with the idea of the fungal world that we all live within. So it's awesome. I mean, he talks about, you know, fungi, however you pronounce it, was like the first life form on the planet before, they created dirt basically, so nothing could live or breathe until they had established themselves. And yeah, it's awesome. I highly recommend it.
So we're really beholden to our fungi overlords. Like that's they're the basis of all life. This is absolutely. I never thought of it.
Actually, you might find this interesting. Part of the book was talking about utility of fungus and decomposition. So they're using different mushroom strains to decompose like brownfields type stuff. So there's mushrooms that can break down radioactive material and like all this crazy toxic stuff and like clean it basically.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, that is a terrific kind of recommendation. So we'll make sure that we have to look that one up. Michele, I want to thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you're going to be doing with ACEPGH, the Assured Cash Experiment. It's great to have you here, and great to have you a part of the team and doing the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Excellent. And thank you all for listening in to the Grant Street Experience. We want to thank our guest, Michele Abbott, and thank you guys for listening in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much, and have a great day.